Okay, so this is the third video now when we're looking at market failure, and we're continuing on looking at the social costs of production. I'm going to be looking at this on the equilibrium quantity. So we were looking at steel. So if you remember, not all the costs of producing steel are actually borne by the company. The company look at the cost in terms of the raw materials, the energy to smelt steel, the labour, the transport, but there's other factors which aren't being taken care of. There's the pollution and the environmental damage, the carbon dioxide, the smoke emissions, the pollutions in the water, and a whole selection of damage and risks. There's the health effects, and we might see smog, or we might see poor air quality, which may affect the health of people living in the area. And then there's the potentially negative social effects, which depending on how the company actually runs the operation. So the more steel is produced, the greater these effects and the greater the social costs are. So we need to start taking into account these when we actually start discussing the economics of a production. One thing to remember though is there might also be social benefits, which we'll be discussing later. If we turn back to our marginal costs chart, and you see we have the marginal costs, and if we think of this in terms of the supply curve, and we can see where it meets the demand curve, and we get the equilibrium, the amount of steel the company would like to produce at that price. If we look at this new curve, MSC, the marginal social costs is in red. This is the marginal social costs added together to the marginal costs, and it can actually be seen as representing the real cost of producing that steel. And if we look at the curve now, we actually have this second equilibrium point, and it's actually now more socially desirable to actually supply the steel at this second level. And as you can see, the quantity of it has reduced and the price of it has reduced. So it's socially desirable to actually produce a smaller quantity of the item. If we consider the impacts of these social costs of production, it's a good way of actually really thinking about how these impacts can affect a business. This is the effect of shifting the total supply curve to the right, but it doesn't affect the supply curve for the company. So now we've got this problem, you see, because the costs are high, but the company aren't actually having to pay it. So the company manufacturers at quantity 1 and quantity 2, but the socially optimal quantity at the price is quantity 2. If we just go back to the sheet, we can see here it's a much smaller quantity. Is actually best looking at it from the socially efficient way. Okay, well, why does it happen? Well, the problem is no one actually owns the land, the rivers or the air, and therefore no one economically can charge for them or can charge for the harm that's actually being done to them. I mean, if you harm something I own, or my land or my services, I can punish you by charging you for it. But if no one actually owns a product or owns a service, it's very difficult to actually charge, and therefore these costs actually go uncharged. If we could charge for it, then the cost of this pollution will be higher, the costs will go up, and the supply curve would shift left, and you would see a quantity demanded reduce. The free market therefore fails to deliver social efficiency. It's not able to act alone, it's not able to change some of the additional costs. So this is an example of an externality, or the cost or benefit outside the social equation. And actually look now to actually see how it can be addressed. Well, there's three potential answers. Answer 1 is corporate social responsibility. And we did explore this in the introduction to management and the broader interactions of a business. Could be a business case or ethical case for acknowledging responsibility for wider implications of actions, and some firms do take this on board. There's also social costs and social benefits of decisions which are taken to some extent into account. And some firms they acknowledge and they do pay close attention to their knowledge of social responsibility. So corporate social responsibility is one potential answer. The second potential answer is tax intervention. So taxes can be used to increase the cost of production to the company if we actually put the cost of the tax instead. So the government can actually use the taxes to manipulate the costs of the company. Now this has the effect of shifting their marginal cost curve to the right and adds to the cost of production. And this then brings the profit maximising output closer to the socially optimum output. And the output is what actually the company wants to produce. So if we look at this marginal cost curve now, so you see we have the blue curve, the marginal cost, and then we have the red curve which takes into account the marginal social costs. And that's actually, you can see, there's actually quite a huge shift here. If we were to impose a green tax or environmental tax, we would actually see the marginal social cost and the marginal curve with the tax added closer to the total cost, and the difference in quantity a company is prepared to supply at a given price is much smaller than in the previous example. So if we look at this example here, if we have the marginal cost and tax, which is the blue curve, and then here we have the marginal social cost, the difference is actually much smaller than if we compared it to our previous example here without the tax. So by adding the tax, we actually make this difference much smaller. So tax does actually offer one way of increasing costs to a firm, even though no one could actually impose a cost for environmental or social damage that might be done through this production. The third way things could be looked at is in legislation, and the government can use legislation. They can make them be required by law to limit pollution or other social costs. It may make them change the way it behaves to communities, or to change the way it works to the exploitation of workers. It could limit action or limit production at the same level of pollution, and it could reduce the amounts of pollution perhaps by limiting the social costs of production. And the total social cost of production is reduced. So with social costs, the problem is the cost curve to the company and the cost curve to the society are different. Or the cost that's not being charged to the supplier, and the government have this challenge of finding the way of getting companies to alter their behaviour, either through corporate social responsibility, or through tax mechanisms which increase the cost, or through legislation which acts to limit the company's activities by law.